Hello YouTube! In this video I'm going to take a look at ontological nihilism. This view is defended by Jan Westerhoff in his paper An Argument for Ontological Nihilism. So ontological nihilism is the view that nothing exists, period. There is nothing at all. There are no things, no objects, no properties, no events, no structures, no experiences, no minds. There's nothing. Nothing, period. And when we say there's nothing, thing is to be understood in the broadest sense. So the ontological nihilist does not mean to say merely that there are no things in some technical sense of the word things, e.g. there are no concrete objects. No, the ontological nihilist means there's just nothing of the sort that any person has ever believed in. There's nothing, period. Why on earth would we take this kind of claim seriously? I mean, I suppose one thing that's worth noting here is that many philosophers are restricted nihilists in the sense that they deny the existence of specific things. So, moral nihilists deny the existence of moral properties. Mereological nihilists deny the existence of composite objects. They hold that there are only simples, no object has parts, so there are no chairs or tables, only collections of particles arranged chair-wise or collections of particles arranged table-wise. Nominalists deny the existence of abstract objects, so they deny the existence of objects like numbers or sets. Idealists deny the existence of material objects. So there's all sorts of more kind of restricted nihilisms that deny the existence of specific things. The ontological nihilist denies the existence of everything. So, I mean, ontological nihilists could appeal to some of the arguments that are deployed against the more restricted nihilisms in defense of at least part of their thesis. But is there any reason to take, any general reason to take ontological nihilism, this very general denial of everything, seriously? Well, Westerhoff argues that ontological nihilism follows from two premises that are independently plausible. So we'll take a look at this argument for ontological nihilism. Okay then, first premise is what we can call non-fundamentality eliminativism. This is the premise that only the fundamental exists. So for something to be fundamental means that that thing is not dependent on anything else. Consider chairs. Chairs are not fundamental because if they exist, they depend for their existence on the existence of particles arranged in a particular way. And of course, those particles, perhaps themselves, are not fundamental either because they depend for their existence on the existence of entities such as strings or whatever else it is that physics ends up postulating. So more precisely, we will say that O1 existentially depends on O2 if and only if O2's failing to exist entails O1's failing to exist. Now, there are many kinds of existential dependence. The dependence of the chair on the particles of which it is composed is a kind of constitutive dependence, right? So this is a case where, like, a whole object depends on its parts. There's also causal dependence, where an effect depends on a cause. So my existence causally depends on the activity of my parents. There is perhaps a kind of conceptual dependence. The concept of contradiction depends on the concept of negation. Now, the non-fundamentality eliminativist holds that, strictly speaking, all that really exists is whatever is fundamental, whatever is not dependent on anything else. Now, I should note that from an eliminativist point of view, we do have to be a little bit careful how we elaborate this notion of dependence, because at least initially it might seem as if the eliminativist is postulating a relationship between two things. So the things on the fundamental level, such as particles, and the things that are dependent on them, such as chairs. Right? It looks like they're postulating a relation of dependence between these two things, but then they deny the existence of one of these relator. But, of course, it doesn't make sense to say that chairs are dependent upon particles if chairs don't exist. So, to quote Westerhoff, strictly speaking, eliminativists do not want to say that the base level stands in relation to something non-existent, but that the base level has properties that give rise to the mistaken impression that it stands in relation to something. So if we suppose that the base level consists of particles, then we should say that the properties of particles give rise to the mistaken impression that particles constitute chairs. It's not that chairs are dependent on particles, but that if chairs existed, they would be dependent on particles. And the fact that they would be dependent on particles, if they existed, shows that they in fact do not exist, according to non-fundamentality eliminativism. So for the eliminativist, there actually are no dependency relations. There's only the fundamental things. There's only the fundamental things, and those fundamental things don't bear any relation to any other kind of thing, because there is no other kind of thing, right? So there are no other things, and there are no dependency relations. The second premise is non-foundationalism, which says that there is nothing fundamental. There is no base level of things whose existence is not dependent upon the existence of other things. This could be because there is an infinite descending sequence of dependence relations. So chairs are dependent on particles, particles are dependent on strings, strings are dependent on something else, and just so on, all the way down infinitely without any lowest level. So for any given level, it is dependent upon things at a lower level. Or maybe the reason there's no base level is because everything is dependent upon everything else with a sort of complex web-like structure. So this is illustrated in the metaphor of Indra's net. So consider an infinitely large net with a perfectly reflective jewel at each vertex, where each jewel is reflected in all of the other jewels in the net. So if you select one of those jewels, the properties of just one of those jewels are going to be dependent on all of the other jewels in the net, because they're all reflected within that jewel. And then, of course, each of the jewels reflected in any given jewel themselves will display that particular jewel. So the jewel is reflected even within itself. So, like, within any given jewel, everything else is there. And maybe the whole world is like the jewels of Indra's net. So these are two premises, right? We have non-fundamentality eliminativism and then non-foundationalism. And the key point is that both of these premises have been defended by various philosophers historically. So both of these premises are independently plausible. There are things to be said in favour of each of these premises. But together these premises entail that nothing exists. So we have premise 1, only the fundamental exists. Premise 2, nothing is fundamental. It follows that nothing exists. There are philosophical positions that are taken seriously that lead us to the conclusion that nothing exists. So this is enough to put ontological nihilism on the philosophical table, as it were. Now, in this video, I'm not going to spend so much time on the arguments in favour of ontological nihilism. I mean, obviously, there are plenty of criticisms that could be raised against the argument I've just outlined. What interests me here is that no matter how apparently compelling an argument for ontological nihilism might initially seem, very few people are likely to be converted. Ontological nihilism is, after all, completely absurd. And so we might think, well, there's very little point attempting to present arguments in favour of positions if nobody can take those positions seriously in the first place. So the first task for an ontological nihilist will not be to present an argument for the position, but it will be to deal with the objections. It will be to show that actually, no, this position is not something that we can just immediately rule out. So let's turn to some of those objections, right? What exactly is supposed to be wrong with ontological nihilism? What is it that makes the position so absurd? Well, first of all, there is the objection that ontological nihilism is contradictory. The objection goes like this. If ontological nihilism is true, so premise 1, if ontological nihilism is true, then the proposition nothing exists is true. And we don't have to frame this in terms of propositions. We could talk about, the thought that nothing exists, or the sentence that nothing exists, or whatever else. But I'm just going to talk about propositions, just because I like the word proposition. So premise 1, if ontological nihilism is true, then the proposition nothing exists is true. Premise 2, if the proposition nothing exists is true, then the proposition nothing exists exists. So that is, the truth of some proposition entails the existence of that very proposition. A proposition could not have the property of truth if it did not exist. Premise 3, if a proposition exists, then something exists. So, conclusion, if ontological nihilism is true, then something exists. But that's a contradiction. So ontological nihilism must be false because it's logically contradictory. If you try to assume that nothing exists, then you end up having to say that something exists. So what might we say in response to this? Well, Westerhoff responds that all that this argument really shows is that if ontological nihilism is true, then ontological nihilism is inexpressible. So what we can say is that if there is a proposition that expresses ontological nihilism, this entails that ontological nihilism is false, because there would exist the proposition, and there would exist the expression, so there would be things. But Westerhoff says it doesn't follow that ontological nihilism entails its own falsity. Ontological nihilists should just grant that there are no propositions, no thoughts, no sentences, and so on, and so there is no way to express ontological nihilism. I mean, it might seem as if we can express ontological nihilism, but this isn't really so. There is no way to express ontological nihilism. So ontological nihilism is, if true, inexpressible. But that doesn't show that it's contradictory. And more generally, I suppose we should note that there are plenty of philosophers who will say that, strictly speaking, there just are no such things as propositions or meanings, even. So Quine and Kripke-Wittgenstein are famous advocates of certain versions of meaning skepticism. I've discussed Quine and Kripke-Wittgenstein's arguments in other videos. I will link to those videos in the comments. So, I mean, if these sorts of arguments are right, then their very positions are, in some important sense, inexpressible. So ontological nihilism is not unique in terms of its truth entailing its inexpressibility. But, I mean, I suppose this still sort of leaves us with this question of, well, how are we to sort of understand this thesis then? I mean, if it's the case that it's, if true, inexpressible, then, how do we even comprehend it? Like, how do we make sense of it? So, what the ontological nihilist might say here is something like this. I mean, so first of all, we can imagine a world in which there is nothing, period. Now, I mean, I should note, actually, this is controversial. When I say that we can imagine that there is absolutely nothing at all, that's controversial. The reason why is that many philosophers would say that a totally empty world, so nothing at all, is logically impossible. Indeed, the usual view of propositions is that propositions are abstract objects, and that abstract objects, if they exist, necessarily exist, which means they exist in all possible worlds. So if there are propositions, it is impossible for these to fail to exist. But still, we might think that it is possible to imagine or to conceive the impossible. So check out my video on conceivability and possibility. Again, I'll link that in the comments. So if we can conceive the impossible, then we can conceive that there is absolutely nothing at all. If we can imagine the impossible, then we can imagine that there is absolutely nothing at all. Now, given that we can imagine that there's absolutely nothing at all, we can then see that if there's absolutely nothing at all, then there can be no true propositions. So in that scenario where there is absolutely nothing at all, there could not exist the proposition, there is nothing at all. Right? The proposition, there is nothing at all, does not exist in the scenario where there is nothing at all. So at that world, at the world at which there is nothing, we could not express the state of that world. But we can express the state of that world at a world in which propositions do exist. And we can see, from the point of view of the world in which propositions do exist, from the point of view of the world in which there are existent things, we can see that no contradiction follows from the proposition that nothing exists. So, like, when I say nothing exists, right? I mean, if I'm able to say that, then I must be saying that in a world in which something exists. So, but what I can do, though, is I can say nothing exists, and that can be a true description of some other scenario, the scenario in which nothing exists. And then I can see, from the point of view of this world in which something exists, I can see that the scenario in which nothing exists is not in itself contradictory. That the proposition nothing exists does not in itself entail a contradiction. So, in a world in which things exist, we can make sense of ontological nihilism. The general point here is that a truth bearer can describe a world correctly, even if it does not exist at that world. So, take the spoken sentence, "There are no human beings." This correctly describes a world at which gravity was 1,000,000 times stronger, so that the universe collapsed shortly after the Big Bang. But obviously this spoken sentence does not exist at that world because there's nobody around to speak the sentence. Well, the thought is we can apply the same idea to propositions in general. A proposition might be true of a world without being true in that world. The proposition nothing exists is true of the world at which nothing exists, but it's not true in that world since it doesn't exist there. Now, of course, one difficulty with this way of putting things is that if there is nothing at all, then there are no worlds and no alternative possibilities. So we can't say that the proposition nothing exists is true of this world in virtue of its obtaining at some other world and correctly describing this world. According to the ontological nihilist, there are no other worlds either. I mean, this, of course, does leave the ontological nihilist without any way of saying that her theory is true, but then, Westerhoff has already granted that ontological nihilism, if true, is inexpressible. The point here is, in a situation where ontological nihilism is false, right, we can express it, and we can, investigate its features, and we can see that it doesn't entail a contradiction in itself. I suppose there is another point here as well, which is, I mean, versions of this, I suppose, could be raised against any objection to ontological nihilism. But the question is, should the nihilist be troubled by inconsistency, right? So if ontological nihilism does entail a contradiction, should the nihilist be concerned about that? I mean, if nothing exists, absolutely nothing, where thing is interpreted in the broadest sense, well, presumably there are no logical laws either. Indeed, Westerhoff himself, in his discussion of dependency relations, says that contradiction is conceptually dependent on negation. So clearly he intends the thesis that nothing exists to include concepts and logical laws, in which case there is no law of non-contradiction, nor is there anything else that could indicate a problem with inconsistency. So it's not clear that an argument showing that ontological nihilism is inconsistent would be viewed as a problem by anybody who accepts ontological nihilism, since there is no law of non-contradiction, since there is nothing else at all that could indicate a problem with inconsistency. There's nothing problematic about inconsistency. We'll come back to this point a little later, but I'll just raise that for now. So anyway, quick advert. If you like my videos, then you should sign up to my Patreon, where you can find a whole lot of bonus content. Unless, of course, the ontological nihilism is correct, in which case I don't have a Patreon and there is no bonus content available there. So we better hope that they're not correct. So yes, sign up to my Patreon. You can lots of bonus videos available there. Or if you just want to, give a one-off donation, you can do that via PayPal. Obviously, anything that people can, any cash you can part with to help support the channel, it goes a long way. It really helps. I also offer private tutoring in philosophy. I have a degree, master's and PhD in philosophy. So send me an email if you want to set something up there, and you can join the Discord. All the links for this stuff are in the description. Okay, let's move on. So even if ontological nihilism is not strictly logically contradictory, a similar challenge is that it is self-defeating. There's a few different ways to make this type of argument, so perhaps the simplest is as follows. The objector might well say that, in principle, there can be no sound argument for ontological nihilism. An argument is sound just in case it is logically valid and its premises are true. Now, if ontological nihilism is true, there are no propositions, no thoughts, no sentences, nothing else, nothing that could serve as a premise in an argument. Obviously, if there are no propositions, there are no true propositions, but a sound argument consists of a set of true propositions that logically entail a conclusion. Moreover, the ontological nihilist denies the existence even of logical laws, so it would make no sense to say that, that an argument is valid, that any set of premises entails any given conclusion. So I mean, the problem is that by introducing some set of propositions or sentences that purportedly support ontological nihilism, the ontological nihilist gives us conclusive reason to reject her very thesis. If we accept ontological nihilism, we cannot think that there is any sound argument for ontological nihilism. So, if ontological nihilism is false, obviously there is no sound argument for it. If ontological nihilism is true, there is no sound argument for it. Either way, there is no sound argument for it. But if we know from the outset that there is no sound argument for it, then why take it seriously? I mean, a similar sort of self-defeat argument might go like this. According to the ontological nihilist, reasons do not exist, so there are no reasons for belief. But if there are no reasons for belief, then there are no reasons for believing ontological nihilism. So according to the ontological nihilist, there are no reasons for believing ontological nihilism. I mean, the point of both of what both of these self-defeat arguments are driving at is that the ontological nihilist cannot, by her own lights, have any justification for her thesis. Notice that this appeal to reasons differs from the appeal to sound arguments in that we can show that whether ontological nihilism is true or false, there are no sound arguments for it. By contrast, if ontological nihilism is false, there might nevertheless be reasons to believe it. So it might be that there are premises that are independently plausible, which are supported by strong arguments, which jointly entail ontological nihilism. After all, there can be strong arguments for false conclusions. But even if some position is false, a strong argument for that position is arguably still a reason to believe that position. Or it might just be that there are practical reasons to believe ontological nihilism, like if an evil demon tells us that he will destroy the world unless we form the false belief in ontological nihilism. But in any case, like I said, I mean, we have a couple of self-defeat arguments here, which are, what they're driving at is the idea that by the ontological nihilist's own lights, there cannot be any justification for ontological nihilism. There cannot be any reason to believe it. Now, unfortunately, I mean, Westerhoff doesn't have much to say about this type of objection as far as I can tell. If I understand him correctly, his response is something like this. So what he says is, well, it appears as if the ontological nihilist utters sentences or thinks thoughts, or, it appears as if she makes inferences which lead to the conclusion of ontological nihilism. So sure, as a matter of fact, there is no sound argument for ontological nihilism, but it appears as if, it appears as if there is, a set of propositions with particular content. It appears as if all of these are true, and it appears as if they entail ontological nihilism. And that's enough to put ontological nihilism on the table. Given that it appears to be a sound argument, we now have to take the position seriously, at least if we are playing the game according to the standard rules of philosophical discourse. So even if there is, in fact, no sound argument for ontological nihilism, and even if we know this from the start, it might still be that, ontological nihilism appears to follow from premises that we independently accept. And this is going to create pressure upon us to endorse ontological nihilism. Now, if we do come to endorse ontological nihilism, then obviously we're no longer going to regard those premises as true. I mean, we're no longer going to think that these premises even exist. Once we come to accept ontological nihilism, we will no longer believe that there are any arguments supporting it. We will no longer believe that there is any, position to be supported by arguments. So this is a situation where we have to throw away the ladder after we have climbed it, as Wittgenstein once said. The arguments are for people who don't currently accept ontological nihilism. Here's another type of self-defeat argument. So the ontological nihilist claims for anything that we say exists, that it doesn't really exist. It's merely apparent, merely appears to exist. But consider, so when we demonstrate that something thought to exist doesn't really exist, it looks like we always end up appealing to other existing things. So suppose that we are in the desert and we think we see an oasis. As it turns out, it's merely a mirage. There is only the appearance of an oasis, but no oasis. What we do find, though, are plenty of existent things that give rise to the appearance. There is blue sky, there are temperature differences, there are light waves, there are atmospheric molecules, and then there's all the ways that these things relate to each other. The bending of light waves from the sky via refraction produces the appearance of the oasis. So, I mean, in general, what we can say is that when it appears to be the case that there's an oasis, the appearance of the oasis depends on the existence of an actual oasis, or on an optical phenomenon such as a mirage, or on maybe some set of brain states producing a hallucination, and so on. But regardless of what we say here, we're always going to be appealing to existent things that give rise to the appearance. So it's tempting to assume what Westerhoff calls the base principle, which says, whenever there is some appearance, there must be something that is not an appearance on which the appearance existentially depends. Now, the challenge for the ontological nihilist is that there is nothing, according to her, there is nothing that can be the source of the appearance. There is nothing on which the appearance can depend. So her strategy for showing that any purportedly existent thing is merely apparent is bound to fail, right? Like, to show that an existing thing, so to show that a purportedly existing thing is merely apparent, we show how that appearance is produced by other things that do exist. Like we always appeal to other existing things as the source of the appearance. But the ontological nihilist does not think that there are any existing things. There is no source of the appearance. So she's, not going to be able to say that purportedly existing things are merely apparent. Or at least, when the ontological nihilist sort of, when she sort of does whatever she needs to do to demonstrate that, say, the oasis, what we think is an oasis, doesn't actually exist, she's going to end up undermining her own position, because she's going to be appealing to things like, light waves, refraction of light waves from the sky. So she's going to be committing herself to other things, and of course an ontological nihilist can't do that. In response to this, Westerhoff says that the base principle is false. So consider this colour illusion. It appears that the shades of grey labelled A and B are different. So it looks like the square labelled A is darker than the square labelled B. In fact, this appearance is false. Both are the same colour. Now, the illusion here, of course, results from the distribution of the colours on the screen, plus facts about the functioning of the human visual system. So, the appearance that the A square is darker than the B square existentially depends upon the actual distribution of colours. But now, of course, we might say, well, these colours are themselves mere appearances, which are to be eliminated in favour of descriptions of wavelengths of light or properties of the surface of the screen or whatever. I mean, there are plenty of philosophers who've held that colour is just an illusion, that strictly speaking there are no colours. The work of C.L. Hardin, for instance, he's argued that, colour just doesn't exist. So, I mean, what we would have here is we would have one appearance that depends upon another appearance. So we would have the appearance that the A square is darker than the B square, right? That is existential. That's dependent on the arrangement of colours. And then, when we investigate the arrangement of colours, we find that this in itself, the colours are themselves just another mere appearance. And it looks like these levels of mere appearance can extend kind of arbitrarily, right? So suppose that you are viewing this very same colour illusion on a television screen, unbeknownst to you. So you think that you're looking at an actual checkerboard made of wood or plastic or whatever, and it's like painted with these colours. But in fact, what you're looking at is just a set of rapidly changing dots of light on a screen. So now we have another layer of mere appearance, right? Because like initially, you think, okay, this is a real checkerboard. I'm looking at an actual checkerboard, and then that itself turns out to be an illusion. So, I mean, it looks like that you can have. So the point is that the base principle is false, right? The source of an appearance can itself be merely apparent, right? Like when we show that something is merely apparent, we can appeal to things which are themselves later shown to be merely apparent, and these levels of mere appearance can extend arbitrarily. So Westerhoff summarizes this. He says, Behind any given appearance, we may find something else which is the source of the appearance, but this does not bring with it any existential commitments which the nihilist would want to avoid, for there is nothing to rule out an appearance that has another appearance as its source. And nothing, crucially, nothing in principle stops an infinite sequence of mere appearances. When it falsely appears that P, what we find upon investigation are other things that give rise to the false appearance that P. But then these other things themselves may turn out to be false appearances, and upon investigation we find still other things that give rise to those false appearances, and this can just go on and on and on indefinitely. The ontological nihilist says it goes on without end. There is no final level of existent things that ground these appearances. Now, of course, it may well be that in any given context, when I dissolve an appearance, as it were, I must speak as if there were existing things that give rise to the appearance. When I show that it merely falsely appears that there is an oasis, I will talk about refraction of light, right? And in explaining what gives rise to the false appearance of the oasis, I just say, well, there is refraction of light, so I'm sort of treating refraction of light as this real thing, or at least I'm not explicitly treating it as a mere appearance. But this doesn't stop me from recognizing at a later point that refraction of light is itself just another mere appearance. In general, I can, I can talk as if something is real, or maybe I should say, I can talk about something without explicitly acknowledging when I talk about it that it is not real, and then, later perfectly reasonably conclude that it isn't real. We do that when we talk about, I don't know, fictions, for instance. I can talk about how the Daleks invaded Earth, that blah, 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 right? And of course I don't really believe in Daleks, but I don't explicitly say that when I'm engaging with the fiction of Doctor Who. So anyway, there's a process of dissolving appearances that we do when we give explanations of false appearances. This process takes place over time, and that's going to require us sometimes to talk as if certain mere appearances were really existing things. Obviously, though, the structure of dependence relations is whatever it is. It's not a process that takes place over time. So that's the response to that one. But perhaps all of this misses the most important point. The real problem with ontological nihilism is that it denies what is just blatantly obvious. So we can make a kind of Morean shift. The Morean shift works as follows, right? Any philosophical argument will consist of a set of premises leading to a conclusion. Now, assuming the argument is logically valid, we have two options. We might accept the premises and so accept the conclusion, or we might deny the conclusion and instead conclude that there must be something wrong with the premises. This is a Morean shift. The ontological nihilist has some set of premises leading to the conclusion that nothing exists. Now, what we might say is that the appropriate response to this is not to accept the premises and draw the conclusion that nothing exists. Rather, the appropriate response is to affirm that something exists, and so conclude that at least one of the premises must be false. If this kind of Morean shift is ever an appropriate move, well, surely it's appropriate here. Again, I'll put a link to, I have a video on Morean arguments that I will link in the comments. So the thought is this: look, it's just obvious. It's blatantly obvious that something exists. This is more obvious than any philosophical premise we might use in an argument to the effect that nothing exists. To deny that something exists would be to deny the basic commitments of both everyday common sense and our more sophisticated inquiries in both science and philosophy. Somebody who sincerely claims that nothing exists, they don't need an argument, they need therapy. It's a crazy position, and it's obviously crazy. It's crazy to anybody who thinks about it for even a second. Samuel Johnson once famously tried to refute idealism by kicking a large rock and saying, "I refute it thus." Now, that's not a very good objection to idealism, but in response to ontological nihilism, what more could you want? Clearly there's a rock there. Look, it's just obvious. It's obvious that something exists, and no philosophical argument could ever dislodge that that belief. So I suppose it's worth considering what exactly it is that's supposed to be obvious here, right? I mean, I think that so when we say that it's obvious that something exists, we can distinguish two interpretations of this claim. So first, it might be said that it's obvious that some specific thing exists. So to take the example that was given by G.E. Moore himself when he, initially gave this sort of argument, it might be said that it is just obvious that hands exist. All I need to do in response to the ontological nihilist is hold up my hands. I say, look, here's one hand, here's another, so at least two hands exist. So some things exist. There are some things that are just obviously part of the furniture of the world. Now the thing is that if this is how we're interpreting the claim, then in response to this, we can of course appeal to the many philosophical arguments against whatever specific thing it is that is cited as obviously existing. I mean, it's worth noting that, I mean, first of all, for anything that we cite, right? Let's say we cite the existence of hands as just being completely obvious, right? Well, there are going to be plenty of philosophical positions which deny the existence of hands. There are plenty of perfectly sane people who have been led to doubt whether hands really exist as a result of philosophical argument. And I think, reflecting on philosophical arguments, at least for some people, maybe not for all of them, but for some people, reflecting on philosophical arguments against the existence of hands may well remove the initial impression that the existence of hands was obvious. I mean, maybe you think that the existence of hands is obvious until you encounter the arguments against the existence of hands. And then, once you've worked through those arguments, you might well think, maybe that's not so obvious after all. But I mean, the key point for now is just, look, if we say that what's obvious is the existence of hands, well, there are plenty of philosophical positions that will deny the existence of hands. There are plenty of philosophers who doubt the existence of hands. So it looks like ontological nihilism is not uniquely absurd by with respect to denying the existence of hands. And I mean, it's not just philosophy, right? I mean, there are certain forms of meditation or religious experience have led people to deny the existence of ordinary objects like hands. So there's lots of kinds of perspectives, let's say, from which a person might well end up doubting the existence of hands. So if we respond to ontological nihilism by picking out some specific thing and saying, well, it's obvious that this specific thing exists, it looks like that's not going to leave ontological nihilism much worse off than any of the other philosophical positions that deny the existence of that thing. If we say that ontological nihilism is absurd because it denies the existence of hands, well, there are many philosophers who deny the existence of hands who are taken seriously. So, I mean, okay, maybe it's still absurd, but it's not that absurd relative to these other philosophical positions like mereological nihilism. And so, I mean, look, for any specific object we cite, for anything that we cite, we can find philosophers who deny its existence. We can find philosophers who deny the existence of moral values, of mental states, of mathematical objects, of the fundamental entities postulated by the sciences, and so on, right? So a second way to interpret this idea that it's obvious that something exists is, well, instead of saying of some specific thing that it is obvious that that thing exists, we might say it's obvious that something or other exists. It's obvious that there is something or other. It's obvious that the proposition something exists is true. It's obvious that there isn't nothing. But is it? I mean, is this actually obvious? I suppose the question is, what exactly is the content here? What is it that's obvious about this? So if we say, well, it's obvious that the proposition something exists is true, what makes that obvious? What is it that's obvious about that? I think a worry that we might have with this line of argument is that we might think that the obviousness of existence is always attached to some specific thing or other. After all, it's not obvious that unicorns exist. I mean, right now, as I record this video in my room with the windows closed and everything, it's not even obvious The sun exists, at least not in terms of my immediate experiences, right? For most of the things that I think that there are, their existence is not obvious, and there are many things that I think are not, and their existence certainly isn't obvious. So, okay, I can say it's obvious that something exists. Well, what? What? Like, it's obvious that what exists. And then we're going to cite something specific. We're going to say, well, it's obvious that hands exist, or it's obvious that chairs exist, or it's obvious that emotions exist. But then we're back to the first version of the Morean response. So, I mean, the Morean says, look, it's obvious that something exists, but this has two interpretations. If the Morean intends to specify some particular thing and say the existence of that particular thing is obvious, then the ontological nihilist can point to the various other philosophical positions that deny the existence of that thing. And so they'll say, well, look, ontological nihilism is no more absurd than these other positions. On the other hand, if the Morean intends to say, well, it's just the existence of something or other is obvious, it looks like it's open to the nihilist to just deny that claim. Like, that's actually not what we find obvious. Or, what's really going on here is a disguised appeal to the first claim. So with all of that said, we might well think, look, there's one type of thing that the ontological nihilist can't do away with so easily, and that is the appearances themselves. I mean, why do we think that there are hands? Because it visually appears as if there are hands. Now, of course, the mere appearance of hands is consistent with the claim that hands do not exist. It may be that there appear to be hands while there are no hands in any sense at all. By comparison, it appears that there is an oasis in the desert, but in fact there is no oasis, not in any ordinary sense of the term oasis. And so when I say something like, there is an oasis about a mile away, my term oasis does not refer to anything at all there. I mean, there actually just isn't anything there. It doesn't, my term doesn't refer there. So, there's a mirage which has the effect of producing a false belief where I think that something exists that doesn't actually exist. Now, this point, of course, so this is important for the ontological nihilist because it allows her to explain our initial assumptions about the world. The ontological nihilist can say, well, sure, it appears that there are many things, but it doesn't follow that any of those things exist, right? So despite the appearance of an oasis, the oasis does not exist in any sense at all. Similarly, despite the appearance of many things in the world, these things do not exist in any sense at all. But this kind of argument only goes so far, because an appearance is itself a thing. Remember, we said at the beginning, thing is to be interpreted in the broadest sense of the term, right? So if there is the appearance that P, then there is something. I mean, not necessarily P, of course, but there is the appearance that P. There is the appearance itself. So the ontological nihilist can't so easily dispense with appearances. I mean, even if on reflection, given reflection on philosophical arguments, we reach the conclusion that nothing exists, surely we can't deny it appears as if something exists. But once we say that it appears that something exists, well, we have an appearance, we have a thing, we have something that exists. If there is an appearance, then there is something. So, I mean, it probably comes as no surprise that the nihilist's response to this will be that there are no appearances. Appearances do not exist either. There are no hands, and there is not even any appearance of hands. Now, granted, when we initially talked about hands, the ontological nihilist says, well, there aren't really any hands, what merely appeared to be hands. Turned out there are no hands. But she can now say, look, the appearance of hands is itself merely apparent, right? Just as there aren't really hands, there isn't really the appearance of hands. Just as we can show that hands were merely apparent, we can show that the appearance of hands is merely apparent. Recall the example given earlier of the colour illusion, which illustrated a sort of hierarchy of mere appearances. Essentially, the same idea can be applied here. I mean, there's still a sort of worry here that, like, well, how do we make sense of this? How do we make sense of the idea that an appearance is merely apparent? So Westerhoff gives the following example. He says, if we watch a film about a tiger in the cinema, There is the light flickering on the screen, which is the basis of the appearances, but there is not also the appearing tiger as a distinctly existent entity. So when we watch the film, it appears as if there is a tiger. I mean, maybe in the right circumstances we would be deceived into thinking that there really was a tiger. But, we can show that the tiger is merely apparent. Actually, there is no tiger. But crucially, there is no need to postulate that there is some level of existing appearances. All that we need to postulate here is the source of the appearance of the tiger, and that's that, right? All we need is the light flickering, and that's that. And then of course, this source of the appearance can itself later be eliminated as also merely apparent. So essentially, like we have a situation where like it appears as if there is a tiger, and then we can kind of analyze this. We investigate a bit more closely, and we see, well, no, there isn't a tiger. The tiger was merely apparent. But what we're doing there is we're not postulating something, the appearance of the tiger. We're just postulating things like, light flickering and cinema screens and so on. So basically, when we investigate the appearance of the tiger, what do we actually find? Well, all we find is the projector, the light emitted by it, the cinema screen, the eyes and brains of the people viewing the cinema, and so on. Nowhere in any of this do we find the appearance of the tiger as this distinct entity. It's not as if there is the projector, the light, the cinema screen, plus the appearance of the tiger. So if we think that there is this thing, the appearance of the tiger, where is it located? What are its properties? It's much simpler to say what's going on in the cinema makes it appear as if there is a tiger. But all that there really is here is what's going on in the cinema. Maybe we could say that the appearance is just like constituted by what's going on in the cinema plus our reactions to it. I mean, maybe the appearance is a kind of relational property between a viewer and something viewed, but in that case, there's no problem because, again, both the viewer and what's being viewed can also be shown to be merely apparent. But anyway, the sort of line that Westerhoff takes here, at least, is to say, well, look, there are certain things which make it appear as if there's a tiger. So there's X, Y, Z, right? We have a particular setup which makes it appear that there's a tiger. But what we find is that all that there really is X, Y, Z, right? It's not that there's X, Y, Z plus the appearance of a tiger. There's just X, Y, Z. And then, of course, when we investigate X and Y and Z, we can show that, no, those are also merely apparent. And those will also end up being, discarded in favor of the sources of X and Y and Z. And so the same goes for other appearances, right? We're in the desert. We see what looks like an oasis. It appears as if there is an oasis. When we investigate the appearance of the oasis, what do we find? We find the sky. We find light waves refracted in the atmosphere and so on. All we find is the source of the appearance. We don't find the appearance of the oasis. The oasis appears to be vivid blue. What is it that's actually blue? There's no blue object in the brain, no blue located where the appearance appears to be. The only thing in the world that's actually blue is the sky, right? So we never find appearances, we only find sources of appearances. So, I mean, when we talk about the appearance of an oasis, this is just a useful manner of speaking. When we are in the desert and we appear to see an oasis, of course we don't really see an oasis, but also we don't really see the appearance of an oasis. We see the sky, the sand, and so on. That there appears to be an oasis does not entail that there is something that is the appearance of an oasis. The most that's required here is that there is something that makes it appear as if there is an oasis. But as noted earlier, right, so we have the source of the appearance, right, that we have something that makes it appear as if there is an oasis. But as noted earlier, this source of an appearance may itself be merely apparent. So, I mean, this is sort of one line that the ontological nihilist might take here in order to show that she does not need to be committed to the existence of appearances. Okay, here's a final worry about ontological nihilism. So we might well think the trouble with ontological nihilism is, in a sense, sort of the mirror. It's the opposite of the self-defeat problem, right? The issue is not that it's self-defeating. The issue is that it's self-immunizing in a way which violates basic standards of philosophical argumentation. Basically, the problem is this. Anytime we present a counter-argument to the ontological nihilist, she can respond by just denying that there are arguments or premises or anything else. Anytime we point to a potential counterexample to ontological nihilism, anytime we try to, say like, well, hey, look, this thing exists, the ontological nihilist can respond by just denying that the thing in question exists. As we noted earlier, she's not even going to be troubled by inconsistency. She denies the existence of logical laws, of contradiction, of negation. As far as she's concerned, nobody ever denies her position in the first place. So the worry is that this ends up being a sort of Monty Python-esque position. Whenever we try to make any assertion that so-and-so is the case, the nihilist just responds, oh no, it isn't, and she can leave it at that. And by her own light, there's nothing wrong with responding in that way. So in principle then, we can't really enter into an argument with the ontological nihilist. She's not going to play by our argumentative rules. It would be like trying to play a game of chess against somebody who doesn't care about the rules of chess and who simply throws the board off the table every time you make a move. There is, in principle, just nothing that we can say that would raise even a prima facie challenge to the ontological nihilist. But that's a bad thing. That's not something we want from a philosophical position. So what might we say to this? Well, first of all, Westerhoff notes that this is only going to be a matter of how people choose to argue for ontological nihilism. Of course, the position could be argued for in this way, but it need not be. Nothing prevents a person who endorses nihilism from attempting to defend the view according to the usual conventions of philosophical argument, and nothing prevents an opponent of nihilism who is playing devil's advocate from doing the same thing. And if they're able to do that, right, so if they're able to present a case for ontological nihilism that does play by the usual rules of philosophical argument, well, surely we should then take it seriously. After all, one of the conventions of philosophy is that we are supposed to evaluate the arguments in themselves, right? It doesn't matter who made an argument. It doesn't matter, what other sorts of arguments might be made, right? Like when we are presented with an argument, one of the conventions in philosophy is we just take the argument in itself and we evaluate it on its own terms. And we don't think about like where it comes from or what else, the argument might be doing. At least that's one of the things we should do is, we just look at the argument in itself. So it's no objection to an argument for a position that there might be other ways of arguing for the position that are silly. That's just not an objection to an argument. I think though there's a further point here about philosophical methodology, right? Which is, what exactly? So like, let's just say that ontological nihilism is self-immunizing. What's wrong with self-immunization? I suppose in some ways this idea of self-immunization is similar to unfalsifiability. Of course, falsification is supposedly a criterion of proper scientific theories. Obviously, we're not doing science when we discuss ontological nihilism. This is pure philosophy. We're obviously not doing science here. But the self-immunization of ontological nihilism isn't ad hoc, right? We can see how this feature follows from the basic commitments of the position. So it's not as if ontological nihilism has become self-immunizing due to how its defenders have modified the position in response to criticisms. It was self-immunizing from the start. Like, we know from the start that no criticism could ever move the ontological nihilist. So I think that's worth bearing in mind that, it's perhaps, this feature of the position, it just sort of follows from its basic commitments. Now, of course, standard philosophical convention does rule out a particular way of defending it, ontological nihilism, but then why accept those standard philosophical methods? Presumably what's going on here is that we have some conception of what the goal of philosophy is, and then we must think that the standard methods provide a reliable means of achieving that goal. Maybe we think that the goal of philosophy is to provide true answers to philosophical questions, and then we think that the standard methods used by philosophers are a reliable means of getting at true answers. Now the thing is that we can put pressure on both claims. For pretty much any goal that we cite, it will be easy to find arguments that philosophers should actually have a different goal, and it will also be easy to find arguments that the standard methods are not a good way of achieving that goal. So let's say we say that the goal of philosophy is true belief. Well, there are plenty of compelling arguments that philosophy should have goals other than true belief, and plenty of compelling arguments that the methods used by philosophers are not an effective means of achieving true beliefs. And I think that, I mean, anybody who is even attracted to a position like ontological nihilism is probably not going to be wedded to standard philosophical methods. I mean, maybe one of the ways in which ontological nihilism is compelling is precisely in how it exemplifies a very different way of, thinking about philosophy and philosophical problems. But anyway, that's that. That's all I want to talk about there. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everybody.